Right-wing journalists like Rod Liddle would like you to think they believe in free speech. In his case, racist columns joking that Asian voters can't tell the difference between choosing a brinjal bhaji side order or filling out an election ballot, or writing, "I have spent the morning trying to draw a cartoon of a black person without being racist. It's bloody difficult, especially the lips," are, he thinks, a matter of principle. How ironic, then, that his latest offensive rant pondered how to stop Muslims from exercising their rights of democratic choice. "My own choice of election date," he wrote, "would be a day when universities are closed and Muslims are forbidden to do anything on pain of hell or something." I'm glad people are calling out this kind of racism. It offends all our common principles of democracy and equality. But spare me the faux outrage. Liddle and so many extreme commentators like him have been spouting this kind of hate for years. Media organisations don't just tolerate it, they encourage it. Let's not wait for the next column that crosses a line to condemn this for what it is: unacceptable racism that's neither satirical nor funny.
First of all, before I go into my argument, you said Rod Liddle was a right-wing journalist. He is not a right-wing journalist. He was a member of the Labour Party until 2016 and was suspended for writing about anti-Semitism within the party. But there you go, that's just by the by.
I thought that might say more about you, Carol, if you think he's not right-wing, because I think most people recognise that his narrative is right-wing. But anyway.
OK, so I want to take you back to when you wrote about Nelson's column. You called for, you trashed one of this country's great heroes. You said he was a racist and a white supremacist, and it provoked national outrage. People thought your comments were offensive. Many said they were repugnant. Even you were accused at that point of being racist by some. There was a professor, a historian called Jerry White. He actually said what you'd said was comparable to ISIS in Iran destroying a culture they believed was unacceptable and thinking it could be erased. You called what she said puerile. I don't know why you're laughing. You called what she said puerile. But anyway, but my point is, it's extreme language. That's what we're talking about, is it not? And yet, so you were allowed to tell your truth, as unacceptable and offensive as that was to some people. And yet Rod Liddle is not allowed to satirise. You know what he was doing. If it was literally, you might not find it funny, but to imagine that Rod Liddle is saying, let's disenfranchise Muslim voters. It's silly. I noticed you skipped over the part in your intro where you mentioned what he'd said about students. What he said about students was that he wanted them drugged with horse tranquilizers and skunk and actually sent to a rave for the day. Do you seriously believe he meant that? This is satire, Afua. You might not like it. Satire isn't often funny, but that's what it is, satire. And you want to deny him the right to say what you had the right to say.
No, I disagreed with Afua when that Nelson column piece was written. I thought
you said it was puerile.
Yeah, I didn't compare it to ISIS. I did disagree with it, and it was on this very show, and we had a live ding-dong about it.
Can I just reply to Carol on that, just on that point?
Sure, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, because I would like you to name a historian who disagrees with the facts of my column. Because there isn't one. Because what I wrote was based on an agreed history.
Irrelevant.
Yeah, no, it's not irrelevant. This was my column wasn't satire. Okay. It was.
I didn't say it was.
It was pointing out historical facts about Nelson.
Didn't say it was.
And by the way, I did not call for his statue to be removed. I said we should talk about the legacy of the history. So how you can compare the two is crazy.
Yeah, otherwise, we're in danger of redoing that debate. So I think what I'd like to say is we all accept that some jokes go wrong, some jokes aren't funny, and some jokes are politically incorrect but still manage to be funny somehow, and that's the art and the magic of comedy. I personally have committed, some of you know about this story, I tried to give a funny speech at a point at an occasion that shall remain unnamed, and it was the worst thing I've ever done in my life, right? And the person that was the target of my so-called funny speech, and rightfully so, were furious with me, didn't speak to me for many months.
Were they in the room?
Yes,
right.
and I speak for a living. I can't say more because it's still sensitive, but I speak for a living, and it was disastrous because sometimes jokes don't land. Now, I think this is quite simple. This is a case where
as a Muslim, how do you feel about
I just don't think this guy's generally funny. But in particular, I think there is a difference between. Look, I think we have to try and grapple with. And this is not by accident, OK? But, he deliberately wrote the column. So we have to grapple with the difference between bullying and joking. And sometimes when you think you're joking, you're bullying people, and sometimes you're not. And if we can at least accept that's a legitimate question, then I think Afwa's got a point.
Majid, can I just come back, just very briefly? Yeah. I was once asked, and I misheard, the great Barry Cryer. Yeah. I was a brilliant, funny man, and I thought I was asked to give a roast for Barry Cryer, and the person had said a toast. So I prepared. The person who laughed the loudest was Barry Cryer. And then when I said, I'm terribly sorry, it was a toast. Coming back to the point in hand, let's see what Rod Liddle, the man himself, says. There was no hate speech or Islamophobia whatsoever in my piece. None was meant, none intended, none should be taken. It was very light-hearted, series of suggestions about when to hold an election based upon the silly dispute over the proposed dates for the election. It was patently a joke, as Carol pointed out. All I would say on this is, and listen to this, you don't have a right to not be offended. Part of being in a society in the West is that sometimes people say, do, write, sketch, draw, things that are... As long as and the tone of the piece, as I'm sure you have, if it was isolated like that, I would absolutely support you. I happen to know Rod Liddle. I admire his writing. I think he's on the money more often than he's not. And when you read the whole piece, it is very, very light and satirical.
Just a quick one, Afua. Well, Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, himself said the piece should not have been published in that form. So even Fraser is accepting that the piece wasn't completely acceptable.
We can read it?
Yeah, go on.
Basically, he said that I'm going to read. This is funny though, because sorry to interrupt you, Hedgen, but it's we've heard of sorries, not sorries. Yeah, sorry, not sorry. This is a not sorry, sorry. It's the other way around. It's a not sorry, sorry. He said if one of our columnists seriously suggested that Muslims and students should be prevented from voting, then of course I would denounce it. It would be disgusting. It would be a disgusting thing to say. But Rod Liddle wasn't doing that. He was satirising the wrangle over the two election dates by making deliberately absurd suggestions. At The Spectator, we have writers who disagree passionately with each other. They often make jokes. But this one was too easily misrepresented and should not have been published in the form that it was. That was the...
There you go. He's saying it should not have been published in the form that it was.
What he's saying is that it was going to be misrepresented, and it has been misrepresented.
Can I finish my point quickly? The only thing I would say, Afua, is in your intro you said that the media not only tolerate Rod Liddle, they also encourage it. And I would say by you doing this topic, you're kind of encouraging it. This is the sort of attention that Rod Liddle wants. I mean, let's ignore him.
I think he does.
I think he does, and that's precisely why he makes these sorts of statements.
If Carol and I have probably been in newspapers for about 180 years, respectfully, you guys haven't, and you're wrong. They do not encourage it. They go out, quite rightly, editors go out of their way to ensure they don't fall into that trap.
But I would say Rod Liddle knows exactly the kind of reaction he's going to get with a piece like this.
I've got to this is a climate in which
leaders
people
like you talking about him.
Katie Hopkins have been published calling for things that I think most reasonable people
Rod Liddle is
agree. And there is a context here, and I just want to show you this. There is a context. This isn't Rod Liddle just making a joke that landed flat, which was your example. This is somebody who has, in recent years, made a name for himself, not just being racist generally, specifically going for this one group, Muslims, people who we know are experiencing a huge surge in hate crime, who have been demonised to an unprecedented extent in the media. And this is what someone from the Muslim Council of Britain says about that context and what it means.
Rod Liddle has a history of racism. Specifically, they're not exclusively targeting Muslims. He's called Muslims savages, claimed that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic, and even called for extremists to blow themselves up in predominantly Muslim areas. And yet he's still given a platform. This isn't a joke. Racism is harmful. It feeds into the far-right rhetoric. And ultimately, editors need to be held to account, as do the politicians who turn a blind eye to this. There needs to be an apology, condemnation of racism, and a commitment that there's no room for it in the media.
And this is really the problem, Carol, when you compare someone like me, and the column you mentioned that I wrote was an anti-racist column. It was saying when there is a history of racism, as there is in Nelson's track record, we should talk about it. You comparing me calling out racism to someone being racist, the two are not equivalent. They're not equivalent.
Let me ask you a question. Do you really think Rod Liddle really believes that Muslims should be disenfranchised? Do you believe that?
It's not that I take the column literally, it's that it feeds into a context where he puts out anti-Muslim messages frequently and is celebrated for that by an extreme that has gained ground.
We're going to move